Spring 1945. Germany was dying. The Reich that had once swept across Europe now lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ash, streets choked with refugees, and the sound of retreat echoing through the forests of the east. In the skies above, Allied bombers roamed unchallenged. On the ground, Soviet armor rolled westward like a steel tide, unstoppable, endless. Every road, every field, every crossroads became a battlefield. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, a single machine, heavy, loud, and almost mythical, still struck fear into advancing troops. The WWII tank. Since its first appearance in 1942, the Tiger had been more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a fortress of steel that could destroy enemy tanks before they even saw it. 88 millimeters of gunpower, a legend whispered across battlefields from Tunisia to Kursk. British tankers called it the Beast. Americans called it the Monster. And to Soviet soldiers, it was simply the Tiger, the predator of the steppe. But by 1945, the Tiger was no longer a predator. It was an endangered relic, fighting in a world that had already moved on. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. And the crews, once elite, now barely trained boys and weary veterans, fought knowing each battle might be their last. In the first months of 1945, German High Command still tried to form pockets of resistance. They threw what little armor remained into hopeless counterattacks. The mighty Tiger battalions that once numbered dozens of tanks were now reduced to a handful. Some crews welded together spare parts from destroyed vehicles just to keep one tank running. Among them was one such machine, a WWII, old, patched, and scarred from years of fighting. It belonged to the remnants of the 510th Heavy Tank Battalion, stationed near Berlin. The men inside knew the war was lost. But they also knew something else. Honor demanded they fight to the end. Inside that last Tiger sat 5 men whose names history barely recorded, but whose courage lived on through the stories told by those who faced them. Unteroffizier Karl Hinz, the commander, once a proud instructor, now a man hardened by loss. Gunther Weber, the gunner, precise, quiet, his hands steady even when shells screamed overhead. Ernst Koch, the loader, barely 19, his first and last war. Friedrich Lehmann, the driver, who had repaired farm tractors before the war. Otto Baum, the radio operator, a former student, now too tired to believe in victory, but too loyal to abandon his comrades. They had survived retreat after retreat. They had lost friends, homes, and faith. And now, in the ruins of Germany, they prepared to fight one final time. The WWII they manned was chassis 250,031, one of the last operational tanks in their battalion. Its paint was faded, its tracks worn thin, its armor scarred with impact marks from Soviet shells. But its 88 MKW 36 gun still worked, and that was enough. It weighed 57 tons, twice as much as a Sherman. It carried thick steel armor, up to 100 on the front plate. And when its Maybach engine roared to life, the sound could be heard for miles. But every advantage came with a price. The Tiger consumed nearly 500 liters of fuel every 100 kilometers, fuel that no longer existed. The crew often siphoned gasoline from abandoned vehicles just to move a few kilometers. Yet even now, when Allied soldiers saw its shadow through the smoke, they still whispered, "Tiger." By late April 1945, The Red Army was closing in on Berlin from all sides. The First Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov attacked from the east, while Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced from the south. In between, chaos. Columns of refugees clogged the roads, mixed with broken divisions, shattered armor, and scattered remnants of once proud units. The Wehrmacht had ceased to exist as an organized force. What remained were small groups of men fighting for survival or vengeance. The 510th Heavy Tank Battalion received one final order: hold the line near the town of Guso, east of Silo Heights. It was a meaningless order, but the men obeyed. Karl Hinz gathered his crew that morning. Their orders were simple: delay the Soviet advance for as long as possible to allow civilians and retreating units to escape westward. They had only one Tiger left. No reinforcements. No fuel trucks. No air cover. Hinz looked at his men and said quietly, "We'll fight until we can't." They loaded what little ammunition they had: 10 armor-piercing shells, 6 high-explosive, and 2,000 rounds for the MG-34. That afternoon, they rolled the Tiger out of the village square and toward the forest road leading east. The sound of its engine drew curious eyes. Children watched from doorways. Old men saluted. It was the last Tiger they would ever see. The battlefield. The landscape around Silo was broken and muddy. Rivers, ditches, and burned-out vehicles everywhere. The spring rains had turned roads into deep ruts. Even the Tiger's wide tracks sank. From the high ground, Hinz could see the smoke columns of the Soviet artillery barrage. Thousands of shells rained on the German positions day and night. Every kilometer, the ground shook. The Tiger crew dug in behind a collapsed farmhouse near a crossroads, the perfect ambush spot. From there, they could cover the only road leading into the village. They camouflaged the tank with branches and waited. The sound of engines soon filled the air, Soviet T-34s, moving fast, supported by infantry. Weber peered through the gun sight and whispered, 2, maybe 3 T-34s. Range 600 meters. Hinz nodded. Wait until they're in the open. The Tiger's gun traversed slowly. The loader cock inserted an armor-piercing round, the last few they had. Through the periscope, Hinz watched as the Soviet tanks crested the hill. Then he gave the order. Fire. The 88 and cannon roared. A flash, a thunderclap, and a T erupted in flames. The second tank swung its turret in panic, searching for the source. Another shot. Another kill. But now the Tiger's position was revealed. Soviet infantry began to spread out, calling for artillery support. Hinz ordered reverse. The heavy tank lurched backward, crushing fences and debris. They fired 2 more rounds, hitting a third tank, then withdrew into the forest. For 3 days they fought like this: strike, move, vanish. Each day, fewer shells, less fuel, and no sleep. But their ambushes destroyed at least 7 Soviet vehicles and delayed an entire column for nearly 48 hours. To the civilians fleeing west, that Tiger was salvation, a wall of steel that gave them time to escape. To the Soviets, it was a ghost, appearing and disappearing in the smoke. But for the crew inside, it was hell. The heat. The constant shelling. the fear that every engine start might be their last. On the night of April 28th, they received their final transmission from Battalion HQ. No further orders. Each crew must act on its own judgment. God be with you. Radio silence followed. They were alone. By dawn, the Tiger had less than 30 liters of fuel left, barely enough for a few kilometers. Hinz looked at his crew. We make our stand here. They chose a small rise overlooking a bridge, a natural choke point. Below, the Soviets were crossing in force. Dozens of tanks and trucks stretched as far as they could see. Weber loaded the last, armor-piercing shell. The air was filled with smoke and the echo of artillery. The war was ending, but for them, one more battle remained. In the ruins of a dying empire, 5 men prepared to fight the last armored duel of the war. Their tank was the last of its kind. Their story almost forgotten until now. The sun rose grey and weak on April 29, 1945. Mist hung low over the fields east of Berlin. The air was heavy with the stench of burned oil and earth. And somewhere amid that chaos, one tank, a single weary Tiger, waited for the Red Army to arrive. Unteroffizier Karl Hinz had chosen his ground well. The Tiger sat half-concealed among the ruins of a small farmstead, overlooking a narrow bridge crossing a flooded ditch. To the Soviets, the bridge was the fastest route toward the retreating Germans. To Hinz, it was a trap. The crew had just 7 rounds left. Each one was precious, every shot had to count. Weber, the gunner, adjusted his sight. The loader, young Koch, whispered a prayer under his breath. The tank's steel hull was damp with morning dew, its engine cold and reluctant to start. At 06:42, Otto Baum heard movement through the radio static, the grinding clatter of T-34 tracks. Dozens of them. They're coming, Baum said quietly. Hinz nodded, adjusting his binoculars. Wait for my mark. Down the muddy road came a column of Soviet tanks, T-34-85s and Su-76 assault guns, their turrets swiveling cautiously. Infantry followed behind, spread out, rifles ready. To them, this was another broken village, another dead end. They didn't know the last Tiger still waited in ambush. The first tank crossed the bridge, its engine growling as its tracks clanked on the wooden planks. Weber exhaled slowly, his crosshair steady. Hinz's voice came through the intercom, calm, measured. Range, 400 meters. Target, lead tank. Fire. The 88mm gun barked. The shell hit dead center. The T exploded in a burst of orange flame, throwing its turret high into the air. The Soviet column halted instantly. Before the smoke cleared, the Tiger fired again, another tank crippled, burning in the road. The Soviets scattered, shouting orders. Mortars began to fall around the Tiger's position, but Hinz didn't move. He waited. Every shell they fired now counted double. Over the next half hour, the Tiger engaged 6 enemy vehicles. 3 destroyed, 2 disabled, 1 vanished into the smoke. But the Soviets were learning. They started flanking through the woods, using speed and numbers. For every T-34 that burned, 3 more appeared from behind the tree line. Soon, the Tiger was surrounded. "We're running low," Koch shouted. "Keep firing," Hinz ordered. If we stop, they'll crawl right over us. The tank's interior was suffocating. The smell of cordite, oil, and sweat filled the air. Empty shell casings clattered on the floor. The loader's hands were blistered, his ears ringing. Then a thunderous impact. A shell struck the Tiger's front plate. The armor held, but the shock threw everyone off balance. Lehman, the driver, slammed the gear into reverse. The Tiger crawled backward into the smoke, its engines screaming. The battle turned into a deadly dance. Soviet tank commanders spread out, firing from multiple angles, trying to catch the Tiger in the open. Hinz used every bit of terrain, hedgerows, shell craters, and burned-out wagons to shield his tank. Each time they moved, the 57-ton machine tore through mud and rubble, leaving deep scars in the ground. Every maneuver cost fuel, and they had almost none. For every Soviet tank they destroyed, dozens of infantry closed in. The Tiger was too valuable a target. Zhukov himself had ordered his units to report any captured German Tiger intact. But Hinz's Tiger would not be captured. By midday, the crew had been fighting for nearly 6 hours. The ammunition racks were almost empty. The heat inside the tank reached unbearable levels. Weber's eyes were bloodshot. His voice cracked from shouting over the engine. Koch's hands trembled each time he lifted another shell, the last few left. Otto Baum could barely keep the radio functioning, filled with static and distant Soviet chatter. Then, as if the world went silent, another direct hit. The tank shook violently. Dust and metal flakes rained from the ceiling. Lehman shouted, "Tracks hit." The Tiger lurched sideways, immobilized. The left track had snapped under the impact of a shell from an Su-85. The tank was trapped, half buried in the mud. Hinz slammed his fist against the turret wall. They were sitting ducks now. The Soviets advanced again, cautiously this time. Tanks flanked from both sides, while infantry crept closer under covering fire. Hinz turned to Weber. "We're not leaving this machine." "Then we die in it," Weber replied quietly. The loader inserted their last, armor-piercing round. Weber aimed at the nearest tank, 200 meters. He fired. The Soviet tank erupted in flames. Then the Tiger fell silent. No more shells. No more miracles. Hinz switched to the hull machine gun. Otto took over the turret gun, firing short bursts at advancing infantry. They fought like cornered wolves. The Soviets encircled the position. Flamethrower teams moved in. And yet still, the Tiger's guns spat fire. At 2:17 p.m., a direct hit from an Su-76 pierced the rear armor. Flames spread through the engine compartment. The tank filled with smoke. Koch coughed violently. The fire spread fast, fuel lines ruptured. Lehman screamed, "It's burning." Hinz's voice was steady even then. "Everyone out." The hatch opened, smoke billowing into the grey afternoon. One by one, the crew climbed out, coughing, blackened, exhausted. They ran for the ditch beside the wreck. Behind them, the Tiger burned, its ammunition cooking off in small bursts. The last roar of a dying beast. They didn't get far. Within minutes, Soviet soldiers surrounded them, rifles raised. The 5 men stood, hands trembling, faces streaked with soot. The Russian officer who approached looked at the burning Tiger, then back at them. He asked one question through an interpreter. "Why didn't you run?" Hinz simply said, "Because it was ours." The officer nodded slowly. Then, with a gesture, the Germans were taken prisoner. Their tank burned behind them until only the blackened frame remained. For the Soviets who witnessed it, the battle became legend. The day a single Tiger delayed an entire armored column for hours. For the Germans, it became a symbol not of victory, but of defiance in defeat. The Tiger was later photographed by Soviet engineers. Its turret had melted, its gun bent, its insignia barely visible. It was transporting to Moscow, studied, then scrapped. The names of its crew faded into history. No official record listed their fate. Some say they died in captivity. Others believe one or two survived, returning home years later to a land they no longer recognized. But one truth remained. They had fought until the very end. The Tiger tank, once the terror of Europe, met its end not in victory, but in defiance. A monument to courage, futility, and loyalty in a war that devoured them all. April 29th, 1945. The last Tiger in the field stood crippled, half buried in mud and smoke. The crew, burned and exhausted, huddled in a drainage ditch as Soviet shells fell around them. The end of their war had arrived, but not their surrender. The farmland around them had become a graveyard of metal. Blackened trees jutted like bones from the earth. Destroyed trucks, broken tracks, and burning tanks littered the fields. Every few minutes, a Soviet mortar whistled overhead, bursting somewhere behind the village. The Germans' radio was gone, their ammunition nearly spent, their tank on fire. But in Hinz's eyes, there was still something fierce, not hope, not pride, only duty. He stared at the Tiger's smoking hull. "She's still standing," he murmured. Then louder, "We'll make them earn it." At 14:30 hours, the Soviets began their push. A column of T-34-85s moved cautiously down the road toward the destroyed bridge. Scouts reported heavy resistance earlier that morning. They assumed a German anti-tank gun or self-propelled gun remained hidden nearby. What they didn't know was that the gun was a dead Tiger, but its crew was still alive. Hinz and Weber crawled back toward the tank through the smoke. The vehicle still burned, but one side of the turret remained cool enough to climb. Inside, the air was unbreathable, a mixture of cordite, oil, and melted insulation. But Weber's eyes went immediately to the gun. It was intact. The breech still functioned. And among the shell casings on the floor, one round remained, a single high-explosive shell. They loaded it. Hinz manned the optics himself. Through the shattered periscope, he saw Soviet infantry moving along the hedgerow 300 meters away, unaware the Tiger was still alive. Elevation 5. "Left 4 clicks," Weber said. Hinz took a breath, steadied the sight, and pressed the trigger. The Tiger's cannon roared for the last time. The explosion ripped through the quiet field. A Soviet truck erupted in flames, scattering soldiers into the ditch. Smoke billowed across the road, confusion spreading through the Soviet ranks. Machine gun fire answered from all directions. The Tiger's hull shuddered under a storm of bullets. Its gun barrel glowed faintly red, and the final casing clanged to the floor. That was it, the Tiger's final shot. Within minutes, Soviet commanders regrouped. 3 T-34s moved to encircle the position, firing high-explosive shells into the ruins. The Tiger's armor, once impenetrable, now cracked and warped under repeated hits. The second round penetrated the right side of the hull, setting off what remained of the fuel tank. The explosion lifted the 57-ton vehicle slightly off the ground. Flames burst through every hatch. Hinz and Weber were thrown backward, their uniforms scorched, faces blackened with soot. They crawled out through the commander's hatch as the Tiger began to collapse inward, ammunition popping like distant fireworks. From 100 meters away, Soviet infantry watched the wreck burn, unsure if anyone still lived inside. The crew Hinz, Weber, Koch, Lehmann and Baum crawled into the ditch again, coughing and half-blind. They moved west, through the hedgerow, avoiding open ground. They no longer fought for victory. They fought to stay alive long enough to surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. But every road west was already cut off. The Red Army had encircled the region completely. To the south, fires from burning villages lit the night sky. To the north, the thunder of artillery rolled endlessly. By nightfall, the men reached a small orchard near a farmhouse. They took shelter under a collapsed barn, listening to the sounds of approaching vehicles. "We can't run forever," Lehmann whispered. "We don't need to," Hinz replied quietly. "Just until dawn." But dawn would not save them. At first light, Soviet scouts found the barn. One shouted a warning, and the entire patrol opened fire. Bullets tore through the wooden beams, splinters filled the air. The crew hit the ground, returning short bursts from their MP-40s, the last ammunition they carried. A few seconds later, grenades arced through the air and detonated nearby. Smoke, screams, confusion. When it cleared, Koch was down, wounded by shrapnel. The rest were surrounded. A Soviet officer stepped forward, shouting for them to surrender. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hinz raised his hand slowly, dropping his pistol into the dirt. The war for them was over. The prisoners were marched east, past columns of burning armor and endless convoys of Soviet troops. They passed their Tiger, now a blackened husk, the gun drooping, the German cross barely visible through soot. Soviet engineers had already begun marking it for transport. In Moscow, the Tiger would be examined by Red Army technicians. They found its armor riddled with impacts, but remarkably intact. In their reports, they called it a formidable machine, too complex for wartime use. Of the 5 men who fought in that last Tiger, only fragments of record remain. Soviet archives list 3 prisoners captured near Gush on April 30th, their names partially legible. Hinz, Lehmann, unknown. They were sent to a labor camp near Minsk, Belarus. 2 were reported dead by 1947. 1, perhaps Weber or Baum, was released in 1950, returning to a ruined homeland where no one remembered his story. The rest vanished into history. When Berlin fell on May 2nd, the Tiger tank, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, ceased to exist as an operational weapon. Of the 1,347 built during the war, only a handful survived. Most were destroyed in combat, abandoned, or scuttled by their crews to prevent capture. The Tiger's myth, however, only grew stronger. To Allied soldiers, it became the symbol of German engineering, terrifying but doomed. To historians, it became a lesson in excess, a masterpiece that arrived too late to change the war's end. In the mud of eastern Germany, the last Tiger's gun fell silent. Its crew, ordinary men trapped in an extraordinary machine, had fought to the very edge of reason. Not for victory, not even for country, but for one another. When the fires burned out, nothing remained but twisted steel and a legend, the final roar of the last Tiger. When the last gun fell silent, Europe was a graveyard. Across thousands of miles, steel lay twisted and rusting, the skeletons of an age that had devoured itself. Amid the ruins, one shadow lingered longer than most. The Tiger. The machine that once defined German might was now nothing more than scrap scattered across fields and forests. But even in defeat, it refused to be forgotten. In May 1945, Allied columns rolled through the wreckage of the Reich. British and American officers, engineers, and tank crews stopped often, not to look at the cities, but at the tanks. Everywhere they went, they found destroyed or abandoned Tigers. Some had been blown up by their own crews. Others sat half-sunken in ditches, their engines burned, their turrets askew. The Allies studied them closely. They measured their armor, tested their guns, took notes. And slowly a picture emerged. The Tiger had been brilliant but flawed. It was too heavy for most bridges, too complex to repair, too expensive to build. Each one required over 300,000 man-hours, 3 times as long as an American Sherman. And for every Tiger built, Germany lost the chance to field half a dozen simpler tanks that might have mattered more. The Tiger had been a weapon of terror, not practicality, a masterpiece of engineering in a war already decided by numbers. American reports described it bluntly. The Tiger is an impressive weapon, but its value is psychological rather than tactical. British engineers admired its precision, but called it over-engineered for a dying empire. Soviet technicians respected its power, but noted that a well-trained T crew could outmaneuver it 9 times out of 10. Yet none could deny its presence. Even destroyed, it commanded respect. The wide tracks, the massive turret, the long 88mm gun, all spoke of a machine built not just for war, but for domination. To the men who faced it in combat, the Tiger was more than steel. It was a feeling, the cold rush of fear, when you saw its silhouette through the smoke. That fear survived long after the Tiger itself was gone. The 5 men of the last Tiger never saw one another again. Karl Hinz and Ernst Koch died in captivity. Lehmann's name appears in Red Cross records from 1948, missing, presumed dead. Weber and Baum may have survived. Some reports mention 2 former tank crewmen returning to Germany in the early 1950s, working in factories, never speaking of the war again. To them, the Tiger was not a legend. It was a coffin they had once escaped. When asked later what they thought of it, one surviving tankman from another battalion simply said, "It was never the Tiger's fault. It was ours for believing it could save us." As Germany rebuilt itself, the Tiger became a ghost of the past. Its name was banned from official history texts for years. But among veterans and military historians, its story survived, passed down in memoirs, sketches, and half-remembered tales. In the 1960s, Western filmmakers rediscovered it. Documentaries, novels, and war movies brought the Tiger back to life. often exaggerating its power, turning it into a near-mythical beast. In reality, few tiger crews ever lived long enough to tell their own stories. But their machine, heavy and flawed as it was, became the symbol of every soldier's paradox. To fight bravely for a cause already lost. Today, only a handful of real tigers remain. Of the 1,347 built, 7 survive intact, scattered across museums in France, England, Russia, and the United States. The most famous, Tiger 131, captured in Tunisia in 1943, still runs today at the Bovington Tank Museum in England. When it moves, visitors feel the ground tremble. The deep growl of its engine carries through the hangar, the last living voice of an extinct species. Each time it starts, cameras click, children stare, and veterans fall silent. Because that sound, that heavy, slow thunder, is history made real again. The Tiger's story has outlived its creators, its crew, even its enemies. It has become a myth, a lesson in fear, courage, and obsession. Engineers still study it. Gamers reenact it. Filmmakers resurrect it. And every time its name appears, it brings back the same mixture of awe and tragedy. Because behind the armor and the engineering, there were always men, cold, tired, human. Men like Hinz, Weber, Koch, Lehmann, and Baum. They weren't heroes or villains. They were just 5 souls in a machine too powerful, too late, and too heavy to carry them home. The last Tiger fell silent on the edge of a dying world. But its echo never truly faded. It lives on in film, in memory, in the roar of engines at every museum that keeps history alive. And somewhere, perhaps, in the quiet moments of an old veteran's dream, the engine starts once more. The gunner calls his range, and the last Tiger rolls forward into legend.